to you, and here we go, looking at courtship, intimacy, and partnering, chapter number 4. Now, I gotta say, I love this family picture, and I think it's because the grandma did such a great job of putting Leonardo DiCaprio's face over her deceased husband, who she no longer, she doesn't want to see his face anymore. I just found that really funny. Okay. There is a lot to talk about regarding this chapter in your text and this topic overall. I could easily create an entire course or two just about courtship, intimacy, and parenting. In fact, one of the other courses I teach is called Love, Sex, and Intimacy. And I do touch on quite a few of these topics in it. So if you've taken that course with me, some of what I talk about may sound familiar. In general, just to keep this lecture kind of organized in your head, think of it divided into two main sections. One focused mainly on love and one focused mainly on sex. Now, it used to be that when two people were married, that commitment was for life, no matter what. And unless I specifically indicate otherwise, that's how I'm going to speak of marriage here, pretending that it's a lifelong commitment that does not end no matter what. And I don't mean that in a sarcastic manner, pretending. I don't think when people get married that they do so anticipating that they'll get divorced. They might not be 100% sure that it's going to work out the way they want it to, but they do intend to try to stay together forever. They want to stay with that person forever. So try to imagine for a moment if that was still, in fact, the case. If your partner was unfaithful to you once or multiple times, if your relationship deteriorated to the point where you didn't even like each other anymore, if they were really irresponsible with money and just spent like crazy and kept your family in perpetual debt, if they were physically or emotionally abusive, if it turned out they were a pretty crappy parent for any number of reasons, no matter what, you would stay married. Really puts the decision to marry somebody in a whole different light, doesn't it? Knowing that you would be expected to, in fact, be with that person for the rest of your life, no matter what. So I'm not being sarcastic when I say, for the purposes of this class, we're going to pretend that once people get married, that it's forever. I really mean I want you to imagine if that was the case. Because if that was the case, if divorce was not legally or even socially acceptable, we would look at marriage in a significantly different way, because deciding to get married would mean there would be a lot at stake for us based on this one decision. Family is a social institution at the same time as it is a personal experience, and marriage is the same. It is a social institution. Now, for some, it's also a religious institution. They truly view their marital commitment as part of a religious commitment that they take very seriously, although that has really declined. And even for many who are married within a religious institution like a church, that's really more for show and to have that moment of walking down the aisle. It's not really done with religious commitment and religious intent. They're not regular churchgoers. Now, we're going to start by looking at arranged marriages. As I said in a previous lecture, as Westerners, when we hear about arranged marriages, our usual go-to knee-jerk reaction is to consider the practice horrible. How miserable it must have to be to have your parents choose who you'll get married to and have children with. We automatically picture a young girl being married off to somebody substantially older than her and having to spend the rest of her life essentially as his domestic and sexual servant. So, to put it simply, in the West, arranged marriages are viewed pretty negatively. Now, keep in mind, I'm talking about arranged marriages, not forced marriages, which may be the same thing, but are not necessarily the same thing. In some societies, arranged marriages have been the social and cultural norm for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And the fact is, When these arrangements occur, they do not necessarily follow the negative pattern our Western minds conjure up. Your text refers to India as an example. And we seem to talk a lot about India in this course, and no, neither I nor the text are picking on it. It's because the social and cultural norms of that country can be so different from ours that it makes a good basis for comparison. Yes, arranged marriages are common in India. Some estimates are that up to 85% of marriages that occur have been arranged by family in that country. You're going to see slightly different statistics depending on whose statistics you're looking at, and because many arranged marriages in India are not registered with the government, as I'll explain in a bit. So this means that the government of India's statistics regarding arranged marriages and child marriages are much lower from what the rates actually are. Except for the Indian government, all stats estimating the prevalence of arranged marriages in India indicate that it is still a widely practiced social and cultural norm that is widely socially and religiously accepted. So here's just a quick little link to a quick video talking to you about arranged marriages in general and why they still exist. Now, I think our most logical starting point when talking about arranged marriage from a Western perspective is why? Why not encourage young people to meet on their own, to have the opportunity to get to know somebody without family interference on their own terms, and through this process find a potential mate? In other words, why don't they do it the way we do? This may have been a common practice historically speaking, but times change. So why hasn't this changed? Well, that is a very ethnocentric way of looking at arranged marriages. In a society where arranged marriage is the norm, they would look at our practice of dating and ask, why would you do that? Why not encourage young people to focus on what's really important, to be more serious in what they consider when making a lifelong commitment, instead of just thinking about what they're concerned with right now? Why allow young people to be focused on superficial things, like how somebody looks and having fun, and instead rely on their own family, who know them better than anybody else, to assist them in matching with somebody? And anyways, you Westerners, isn't the high level of divorce in Western society evidence of the assistance that is clearly needed in choosing a potential marital partner? Clearly, the Western way of finding a marriage partner is not working well. Whether you like it or not, the argument for arranged marriages based solely on our divorce rate alone is a good one, since the divorce rate for arranged marriages is notoriously low. In India, under 2%. So instead of being all concerned about falling in love with somebody, all those unrealistic ideals of romantic love, your culture should be more concerned with two people who are truly suited to each other making a lasting commitment. That's what they'd say. So don't misunderstand as well. It's not that romantic love has no place in arranged Indian marriages. It's that the love is expected to develop over time, over the course of the marriage, and not be present 100% in the beginning. Now, the practice of arranging a marriage is something that goes back centuries in India, when the caste system was still firmly in place, and those in the upper castes were concerned about keeping their assets and their status strong. It then began to spread to the lower caste until it became a norm for all of society. And it's largely persisted in both rural and urban areas for both educated and less educated people. Very simply, when parents feel that their child, whether male or female, is old enough to marry, the process begins. Sometimes they look for a potential mate for their child through family connections. Somebody knows somebody who knows somebody. And it might not be the parents who search for a potential spouse. It may be a family member other than the parents. Often an older sister or an aunt or a sister-in-law. So take note, while certainly parents may do it, It's also just as common for other family members to take charge. Professional matchmakers are also very, very common. And with these, basic information would be provided about the person looking for a spouse, so their own details, what they're looking for in a spouse, and the matchmaker would provide assistance. But the family is still involved in this. It's not just the young person. Now, no matter who's looking for the potential match, what kinds of things are considered? What kinds of things are considered important? Although the caste system is no longer legal, absolutely marrying within one's own caste is still considered extremely important. To the point that marrying outside of one's caste is not even a possibility for most people. So a person's entire lineage, their ancestry, may be considered important. As part of this, what they do for a living and what their socioeconomic status is, especially for males. Religion is important, as is culture. Speaking the same language, as there's many dialects in India. In regards to age, usually the male will be slightly older than the female. And something that Westerners would not usually consider, that is commonly taken into consideration, is horoscope. Matching people relying, at least in part, on astrology. Does physical appearance matter? It's not completely inconsequential. Ideally, the male should be taller than the female. Ideally, a female is considered more attractive if she has a lighter skin tone. And the general attractiveness of the female is considered more important than that of the male. So overall, endogamy is the norm. A potential spouse coming from within one's group, not outside of it. Which really isn't unusual, which is what occurs in most of the world anyways, whether it's done purposefully or not. The fact is, although Westerners like to envision a worst case scenario, an arranged marriage in India or elsewhere is not necessarily forced. In fact, it's now common for young people who are looking to get married to have quite a bit of input, at least in urban areas, and to have veto power. Which means, if their parents recommend somebody they don't like, they can say no. But this will also depend on where they live, in terms of an urban or rural area, and what the norms are in their part of the country. Because India is such a large country with such a big population, there can be really, really big cultural differences between different regions. So whether it's a matchmaker or a family friend who finds potential matches or a family member, usually the potential spouse is presented with some possibilities, and then that list is narrowed down. Are all arranged marriages this way? Absolutely not. Socioeconomic status is going to have a huge effect, because those who are poorer will have less choice. They may simply be told, this is who you're marrying and that's it. And girls especially may have little to no ability to say no. So again, there's a difference between arranged marriages and forced marriages. Another really negative image of arranged marriage, understandably negative, is that it's mainly underage girls who are involved, or girls married to much older men. Yes, child marriage does occur in India, even though it became illegal in 1929. It still not only occurs, but in some areas is very common. Remember I said there can be big cultural differences in this one country because it's so big. So some parts have been pretty well modernized, while others are what we would label pre-industrial traditional societies. Because of this, India has one of the highest rates of child marriage in the world. Because it's illegal, it's difficult to provide the exact numbers. Legally in India, a girl is supposed to be 18 when she marries and a boy 21. But this is not consistently enforced, so it's roughly estimated that about 50% of girls in India are married before age 18, although different organizations, including UNICEF, believe that number is not accurate and it continues to occur at a much higher rate. Now, there's more than one kind of child marriage that is common in India. First, there's the child marriage we all think of, which is an underage girl or boy, although we usually focus on the bride being very young, and they're married, and then they live together as any married couple would. Another kind of child marriage that may occur is when the parents of the two eventual spouses arrange for a marriage to occur between them in the future when they are of age or at least older than they are at that time. But they still won't meet until the wedding day. So the arrangement is made when one or both of them are children. This does not mean that they'll be at least 18 when they marry, but they won't be like 7 or 8. Another arrangement includes a boy and girl being married while young, but instead of living together, they live separately until they're of age because it's illegal. So that way, if authorities get reports of a child marriage and decide to investigate, the parents can deny that it occurred and even say, look, my child lives with me. And in some rural areas that have not undergone really any kind of modernization at all, the marriage ceremony is not a legal ceremony, so two people are considered, for all intents and purposes, married with just a religious ceremony. But since they're not legally married, and thus their marriage is not registered with the local authorities, they're not breaking the law, technically. Why is underage marriage so common? For a number of reasons that are all interdependent and directly support each other. Enormous poverty in both rural and urban areas. Residence patterns that mean keeping a daughter at home and putting the money into maintaining her and educating her is considered a poor investment. As an extension of this, a high rate of illiteracy for girls and their mothers, the dependence of females on males, and the lower status of girls and women overall in virtually every way. I mentioned in a previous class when talking about residence patterns after marriage that a wife will commonly live with her husband and her husband's family in a multi-generational household. So because of this, paying for the education of a girl is not considered as important because she'll eventually take that benefit of education with her, and it's a financial burden for her family. So girls are often considered a financial burden for a family, whereas boys have more potential benefit for their family as a worker. So paying to educate and house a girl contributes to the decision to transfer this to a husband, even at a very young age, since after the marriage, the husband is her guardian and becomes responsible for her. The result is that child marriage is a very deeply rooted, long-standing social and cultural norm in many parts of India, caused by and supported by a variety of factors, so that being illegal is just not enough to end it. Now, the Indian government has tried, it's attempted in the past to decrease the incidence of child marriage beyond making it illegal. So in 1994, the Indian government implemented a program called, in English, My Daughter, My Wealth, in which a girl is provided a long-term savings bond that can only be cashed after her 18th birthday if she is not married. And the government has created publicity campaigns aimed at highlighting the illegality of child marriage that highlight the potential harm that it causes for girls, including a higher rate of maternal mortality, because bearing children at a very young age is a health risk, a higher rate of infant mortality when born to young mothers, and a higher rate of physical violence for girls. And international aid organizations have actively participated in trying to reduce this as well. They do this by supporting the education of girls and their moms, by providing reproductive health care and education for women, with the purpose of being both proactive and reactive. But again, this is a deeply rooted social, religious, and cultural norm. So it's not something that's easily influenced. It's not just a matter of outside influences taking control. And yet it's easy to be ethnocentric, to look down on the country as a whole. But you know, North America is not without its own deeply rooted social norms that have no basis to continue either, such as male circumcision, known as neonatal circumcision. In the past, this was the overwhelming norm in North America and was done for hygiene reasons, for health reasons. But that's no longer the case because we now live in a very different kind of society where a male can easily keep his equipment clean. Yet, thousands of parents of newborn boys continue to want their boys circumcised automatically, and they'll tell you it's because they think that's what looks normal. They're not even doing it for health reasons. Now, this has declined significantly. Now, it's only about 1/3 of newborn males who are circumcised, but that 1/3 still means a million of male infants are. So it's really easy to be ethnocentric and look at other cultures and say, yeah, you're doing that wrong. That's not right. But you know, we have our own things as well. Now, so that's the way partnering is commonly done in India. What about here? You might not realize it, you might not think about it, but Canada and the US are also subject to social and cultural norms in regards to how people here meet a potential male partner. It's just that we're so used to them, we don't recognize them as such. You know, in the last lecture, I spoke about courting, when two people would spend time together with their parents' approval to determine if they would be suitable to marry. Not to have fun, not to hang out and relax. The purpose of courting was to meet a future marital partner. That was the end goal. That was the purpose of it. Then things changed. I said it before and I'll say it again. You're going to have like nightmares of me standing at the end of your bed saying industrialization, urbanization. These two things either outright changed or at least significantly affected virtually every single aspect of life you can think of, including family life, which includes how people find a marriage partner. If these two processes had not occurred, then dating today as we know it would not likely exist. I mean, think of being in a rural area, working at least 6 days a week with no ability of any kind to see or speak with others outside of your family. And the difference between that and then living in an urban area with all these people around you. So for me, when I think what are the two key words we can use to summarize what these changes meant for young people and how they socialized, I think of freedom and choice. Certainly not the degree of freedom young people have today, but a huge increase in freedom compared to living in a pre-industrial rural society. More freedom in terms of who they encountered instead of being pretty isolated. How many people they encountered in terms of less parental supervision. In terms of having at least a little choice in what they did instead of automatically looking after the family farm day after day. So industrialization and urbanization were the start of this really huge change. But right up until the 1920s, the sexual code, sexual norms of society, sexual scripts were really restrictive, especially for girls. Adolescent girls were taught to keep themselves pure and virginal until the right man came along to lead them to the altar. Girls were taught that their virginity was a gift, a precious jewel, a beautiful flower to be saved for her husband on their wedding night. So this meant not only no intercourse before marriage, but no petting, no kissing, nothing. Even in the early 1920s, there was no such thing as dating as we know it. Instead, there was still courtship, in which a young man would visit a woman in her home, only if he had serious marriage intentions. But it was in the 1920s that certain terms that had formerly been regarded as compliments became terms that were viewed almost as insults. Victorian, Puritan, wholesome, ladylike, because the values that were automatically associated with these terms were regarded by many young people as old-fashioned and incompatible with their life. It was in the 1920s that the status of women began to change. So, for example, in the U.S., the 19th Amendment was passed, giving women the right to vote. The status of women generally raised a bit. They weren't entirely equal to men, but there was improvement. It was during the 1920s that women finally cut their hair and wearing makeup became more common. And women became more likely to enter the workplace as emergent adults. Now, they'd quit once they got married or after their first child was born, but it wasn't such a scandal for a young woman to work for a little bit. And having their own income for a period of time gave young women independence. It provided them social opportunities that had been unavailable in the past. Again, more freedom and more choice. Even something as simple as the increase in ownership of personal vehicles in the early 1900s had an effect, especially vehicles with a top. In 1919, only 10% of American cars had tops. But by 1927, this figure had climbed to 83%. Cars gave middle-class young people a means of escaping from the watchful eyes of their parents and neighbors, so they could attend parties and dances and clubs miles away. And, let's be honest, cars also provided, then as now, a roomy enough setting for sexual encounters. But even though, as the 1900s progressed, young people had more options for meeting a potential mate, there were still pretty standard differences in gender in regards to dating. The boy did the asking for a date, he determined what to do on a date, he paid for it, all of that. So gender norms, dating scripts, sexual scripts were still pretty solid. And there is very little outside of these firmly established norms. This is why it would be a really, really big deal when your school had what was known as a Sadie Hawkins dance. This was a dance where the girls were supposed to ask the boys to go. It was the one time it was okay for the girl to ask the boy. Now, these started because of a comic strip that used to be popular called Lil Abner, in which every November there would be one day when there was a Sadie Hawkins Day, and on that day an unmarried woman who lived in their fictional town called Dog Patch could chase the bachelors and marry up with the ones that they caught. Now, I feel like there's a whole bunch of comments I should make here regarding how degrading this is to both men and women, lack of consent, all of that, but that's what they said. This was first introduced in the comic strip in 1937, and by 1939, a few hundred colleges in North America were having Sadie Hawkins events, usually dances. And again, these were a huge deal because the norm of the male being in charge of almost every aspect of dating was so strong. We now live in a society that thankfully has evolved to mean that there is a much wider berth of gender norms for males and females. But even though our ideas about gender and sex and sexual orientation in marriage have changed so much, for the most part, we, meaning the US and Canada, still voluntarily adhere in a lot of ways to gendered norms of dating and sexuality. And we keep doing things this way because, well, we've always done them this way. But beyond that, there really is no solid, specific reasoning. Your text indicates that even now, most males and females still adhere to more traditional gender scripts. Both seem to be more comfortable with the man being the one to ask for a date, to arrange a date, to pay for a date. And I know classical dating is no longer the norm. We're going to talk about that. But even for the male to initiate physical contact, to propose marriage, that sort of thing. Yes, I realize I'm only referring to heterosexual relationships. That's because dating within different sexual orientations just does not have a long, public, widely accepted history to compare it to. So please don't think that I'm being purposely exclusive. That's not my intent. So we may like to get up on our high horse and talk about how modern our society is, how much it has progressed. And yeah, actual dating is less common, and instead hanging out is more common. It's more acceptable for women to initiate contact with the opposite sex. But we still have these underlying gender norms that have persisted. And with this, endogamy has persisted, looking for somebody who is similar to us. In North America, do most people consider it okay to date or marry somebody outside their religion, outside their race, outside their own socioeconomic status? For the most part, yes. But even so, most of us end up doing it. Most of us end up with somebody who is very, very similar to us.